Hello, Art 109. This week we're going to be focused on the artist Amy Sherald, a woman known for her portrait work. So we'll look at the history of portrait painting with women artists of the past and then move into Amy Sherald's work. So before watching this lecture video, you should watch the History of Portraits on Blackboard. The History of Portraits video gives us a sense of what portraiture means. As the video explained, pre-photography, this would be how you memorialize somebody, right? You're going to have to paint their picture. And that's going to be fairly exclusive to rich and powerful folks, think royalty. And you had to have a lot of money to pay a painter, and so it became a status symbol to have your portrait painted. Photography, however, is going to change how painters approach their work because they're no longer going to need to replicate life exactly. So we're going to see some abstract and expressive portraits. So our first example of a woman who painted portraits in the past is Artemisia Gentileschi, an Italian painter. She grew up in Rome in the 1600s, and she was the most renowned woman painter in Europe during the first half of the 17th century. This would be the Baroque era, which is a very dramatic style both in subject matter as well as lighting. And Gentileschi is the first woman to be included in the Florence Academy of Design, and she was trained by her father. So women during this time period, extremely difficult for them to become artists. And if the rare woman was going to become an artist, it was because her father was an artist. And so you can see here on the slide, it says that she served as his apprentice, and as a Roman woman was unable to visit many of the churches and public buildings where her contemporaries had been commissioned due to her gender. So, and beyond even that, we're talking just as a woman going from place to place in public, that wouldn't have happened without a chaperone. So very restricted by gender, but was able to be trained by her father, right? That's going to be an appropriate apprenticeship for a woman who could not serve alongside any other man. So Artemisia Gentileschi took cues from Caravaggio, a famous male artist of the time period. I'll show you his work momentarily, and you can compare the two to see Gentileschi's sort of specific woman perspective compared to Caravaggio's sort of male perspective. But this artist was aware that she was being discriminated against because she was a woman artist. There are 28 letters of hers, and in those letters she complains about pay and gender. So here's a couple quotes. "You think me pitiful because a woman's name raises doubts until her work is seen." She also describes an episode where she was cheated out of work and said, "If I were a man, I can't imagine it would have turned out this way." So she's definitely aware of her circumstance. Now let me, this is a self-portrait that she painted of herself, wanting to be seen as an artist, right? And you can start to see some of that kind of dramatic lighting of the Baroque period. All right, so take this one in. So this is what I meant by dramatic, both in subject matter. We have a slaying, a decapitation happening here, as well as the dramatic lighting. So if we look at this painting, and we look at the citation there first, it says Artemisia Gentileschi, that's the artist. Judith slaying Holofernes, that's the title. So this story was replicated in art quite a few times. It's a pretty popular subject matter of that time period. And it comes from a biblical story, not in the New King James Version, but a Catholic-specific biblical narrative of Judith slaying Holofernes. So in the story, Judith is a beautiful widow who is able to enter into the tent of Holofernes because of his desire for her. And Holofernes was an Assyrian general who was about to destroy Judith's home. And so he is, overcome with drunkenness, and he passes out and then is decapitated by Judith. She takes that moment to take him out and save her home. Often in the story, his head is taken away in a basket, often depicted as carried by an elderly female servant. This particular painting, right, we have it mid-climactic moment. It's during the slaying of Holofernes. We have Judith like holding his head down. His eyes have snapped open. He's awake. He's aware of what's happening. He's attempting to fight back with his arm thrust up toward the maidservant, who in Artemisia Gentileschi's version is younger. They're sort of like the same age. They're kind of in it together, almost like friends, more so this older maidservant that you're going to see in a bit. So we have these two women who are taking Holofernes on together. Like I mentioned, he's attempting to fight back, but that sword is slicing through, and we have just a lot of blood. Judith's face looks determined and maybe even slightly disgusted here. So let me show you Caravaggio's version of this same scene, but we can kind of compare the two versions to see if we can find that feminine perspective, feminist perspective, I guess. So this is his version. So I'll give you all a moment to compare the two. Here's a close-up. So in Caravaggio's version, it's similar, right, in that it's in the moment, and it's in the exact same moment. Holofernes, in the process of being decapitated, has awoken, but what's different are the two women and their involvement in this. So we have an elderly, maidservant kind of holding this cloth. She's ready to receive the head once it's decapitated. And then we have, so that's a pretty passive character, right? She's not involved in this. And then we have Judith, who, if you look at her like muscles, right? And you think about just physically, would this angle and the amount of exertion that she's putting in, would that really get the job done? Probably not. She also herself looks quite passive in this moment. She has his hair in her hands, but you almost get the sense that he could, that she's not really strong enough for the moment. And then her face too is really almost showing concern, and there's a sort of gentleness here, a daintiness that was not present in Artemisia Gentileschi's version. And that's part of feminism too, right? That the perception that women are like nurturing and kind and sweet and nice, and that women have to be that way. That's just not the case. Like, women are capable of, like the complexity of, being complex figures. And if you take that biblical narrative, Judas slaying Holofernes, then Judith's gonna have to be made of strong stuff. Georgette Chen was a Chinese artist that studied in Europe and America and then moved and lived in Singapore. She was known as a portrait artist that painted everyday scenes of Singapore life. Chen was at the forefront of painting in Singapore and developed a modern art style. So we have jumped centuries through time as we get closer to Amy Sherald's work. So Chen moved away from realism and leaned into abstraction. So with textured paint strokes, her paintings have an organic feel to them, and she often uses stark outlines as a key characteristic of her style. So now we're seeing everyday scenes as subject matter instead of the rich and famous, or instead of these sort of biblical narratives. Now let's look at Black portrait painters of America to really show context for Amy Sherald's work. So our two examples are going to be Lois Mailou Jones and Laura Wheeler Waring. Her work featured participants in the Harlem Renaissance, Harlem referring to a particular place in New York, and this is a time period when black musicians and artists are celebrated on a large scale. It's a moment in culture. You can see that painting there of W.E.B. Du Bois. That's going to be a big figure during this time. And Waring was actually criticized for painting famous people and called an elitist. But this artist would argue that there's nothing wrong with painting powerful black people. And she recognized the importance of the time period in black history and captured history as it was occurring. And then also did portraits of everyday people. So notice a couple of the folks, including the little girl on the right. This is a portrait of Marian Anderson. She was a figure in the Harlem Renaissance as well. And you can see here in the slide text that our artist, Laura Wheeler Waring, was commissioned by the Harmon Foundation. So that means that they're paying her to do portraits of prominent African Americans associated with the Harlem Renaissance. And so as she's being commissioned to do this work, you do see her style begin to change. There is some what's called mark making on this painting. You can see the actual marks and brush strokes there on the painting. And this artist was known to change the style, how she painted it, based on who she was painting. So that's pretty cool. Lois Mailou Jones is our other example. She has a very interesting, diverse background that lended itself to the different types of art that she made over her career. So at some point, Mailou Jones left America to feel safe and find success, and she described the freedom of Paris and seeing or hanging out with figures like Josephine Baker. So I think you'll recall in a previous lecture we talked about how figures during a certain time period would actually leave America and go live and work in Europe, where it was just more acceptable for a black woman to be a successful painter. I remember a story of Mailou Jones where she would not put her full name on her artworks, but rather sort of do initials. That way people could potentially think her work was done by a man, and then that would receive better recognition. But in any case, because of the time that she spent in Paris, some of her work is impressionistic. So think Monet with the dappled lighting, usually fun outdoor scenes. And then interestingly, African and non-Western art styles and subject matter became popular with white artists. And Jones took note of this, and Jones thought, well, that should be me. Like, I'm a black woman, like, I don't really want to see like a white artist, profiting off of African and non-Western art styles. So then you start to see her work change. So Jones began to introduce an African art influence to her work. Tribal motifs like in the artwork you see here, Initiation, Liberia, were popular in Paris. Her husband's background was also an influence in her work. He is Haitian. And she became a cultural ambassador to Africa and was visiting these countries right on the continent. So she went to 11 countries, and those cultures that she visited also became incorporated into her work. But she also wanted to focus on the everyday life of African Americans, or about the black experience in America. An important theme or perspective to Jones was dignity and respect. She always tried to treat her black figures, with dignity and respect. So in the painting to the left, if you look at the title, it says Mob Victim, in parentheses, Meditation. So this black man, he is bound with rope, and you get the sense of impending violence. But in this painting, we see a figure looking up. There's a gentleness to him, right? Looking up, perhaps to God. Sort of eyebrows and eyes are wide, like the expression on his face. There's almost a question there and a resignation. maintaining that dignity. There's a ethereal light shining on him as well. And then we have an everyday scene of a woman in the kitchen on the right. So now we get to our artist of the week. So watch the 2 videos on Blackboard called Amy Sherald in the Studio and Everyday People before rejoining us here. Now let's go over Amy Sherald's biography. Born in the 70s in Columbus, Georgia, now based in New Jersey, Amy Sherald documents contemporary African American experience in the United States through arresting otherworldly portraits. Sherald subverts the medium of portraiture to tease out unexpected narratives, inviting viewers to engage in a more complex debate about accepted notions of race and representation, and to situate Black heritage centrally in the story of American art. So this artist recalls being one of only a few Black students at her private school. She is formally trained in art. She has her bachelor's degree from Clark Atlanta University and then received her MFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art. While she was at school, she had an autobiographical focus, right? Did more personal work, but then shifted her content to a critical view of African American cultural history and how African American and Black bodies are represented. So what influenced her to make this shift? Sherald cites photographs taken by W.E. Du Bois, so we've talked about him previously. We're seeing him influence Amy Sherald now. And those photographs, which we're going to see momentarily, contrasted discriminatory representations of Black Americans. There were really everyday, touching, personal portraits present in those photographs, and Amy Sherald understood that that's what was missing in portraiture of Black Americans, so she began to do the same in her paintings. So you'll notice, too, when looking at her work, that Amy Sherald uses an arresting and signature grayscale technique. So grayscale is referring to how her subject's skin tone looks. The darker gray really highlights the skin and Black identity, and she wants her subjects emphasized against these bright backgrounds that she also uses in her work. So as I just mentioned, one of her influences were these set of photographs presented by W.E. Du Bois in 1900. So at the Paris exhibition in 1900, he presented this series of photographs. And so, right, there was a perception of Blackness out there in the world. It was sort of presented a certain way. And W.E.B. Du Bois with photography, right, because the camera, it tells the truth, you know. So he was able to, with sort of photographic evidence, sort of say, like, actually, this is who we really are. This is how I want to be presented. And so for this longest time, you know, as Amy Sherald says, we couldn't control that narrative. But after the invention of the camera, we could become authors of our own narrative. So when she saw those photographs, she was like, I could potentially do the same thing with painting. Other influences include these 2 books. One is Bell Hooks, that's a Kentucky author, Salvation, Black People in Love, and that is about a love ethic. And then the other is Kevin Quashie's The Sovereignty of Quiet, that there is also, you know, along with activism, etc., there's also a quiet resistance that can occur. So these books inspired and influenced her work. Another is, interestingly, Tim Burton's Big Fish. And that movie, right, is about a father telling his life story, but it's almost like a fish tale, right? Like, it's fantastical. But she was inspired by that because that's somebody who's perceiving themselves a certain way on this kind of big scale, and she also found that inspiring. She's also a really big fan of Wes Anderson films, and the way the film looks, his signature style, inspires her style. So you can even compare this movie poster to her next work that I'm going to show you, and you're going to be able to draw parallels to the color palette. So check this out. So those were the artist's influences, what inspired her. Now we're going to look at some of the themes in her work. One of her themes is missing history. Amy Sherald did not see people that looked like her in her art history books and sought to change that. She tells the story, though, too, of looking through the family photo album and seeing this very beautiful picture of her grandmother, who she describes her personal beauty, but also her self-possession, her confidence as she directly gazes at the viewer. So in this picture, her grandmother in all of her beauty is just staring directly into the camera. And so that's what Amy Sherald does with the people in her paintings. And that's what we see with the girl next door. And so that's a powerful gaze, right? That's an interaction. That's like you're looking at the painting, but the painting is also looking at you. And so when we look at this first painting here, the girl next door, you can see the grayscale, of course, and then the bright colors in contrast. And a lot of the paintings in her work are of one figure, which she'll describe like seeing people out even on the street and kind of paying them $100 to take their photo, or bring them into the studio and she'll take their photo and then paint a portrait of them. So we see these individuals kind of in the middle of the painting, usually wearing bright colored, almost jewel tones, and then a solid background. So that's kind of a trademark of her work. That's a whole body of work of hers. And these are typically everyday people, like the title would suggest, the girl next door. And that's also meant to be relatable, right? So if you're maybe like a young black woman, like you went to the art museum, maybe you're also wearing a polka dotted dress, or you're just wearing a dress, or what have you, and you gaze up at a portrait, and that figure like kind of looks like you. You can see yourself in that portrait. It's almost like you can apply that to yourself a bit, right? It's like, oh, like maybe I could be in a portrait, or maybe portraits are for black people too. Now let's discuss the CBS Sunday Morning interview. That interview was about an exhibit that she was doing called Everyday People. And this kind of exhibit was a new direction in her work that reconsidered her perceptions of American history. So in this exhibit, not only displaying everyday black folks, but also kind of in contrast to American history. So if you surrender to the air, you could write it. Her work up top here is referencing this famous photograph called Lunch Atop a Skyscraper, which was taken in the 1930s, kind of considered iconic to Americana. So that also goes along with one of the themes in her work, American identity. So Sherald defines the subjects of her portrait simply as ephemera, floating in tension against abstracted background to American identity. The individuals you'll see are deliberately posed, dramatically staged, and assertive in gaze. And, she throws in some Americana, right? So we look at the painting on the left first, planes, rockets, and spaces in between. We have our two figures. Those are two women holding hands, two black women holding hands. One of the figures is looking toward that rocket ship blasting off, which, that's the space race, right? That's very American. While the other figure kind of turns back around that 2/3 view and stares the viewer down, almost, very not only assertive, but maybe even aggressive. There's a daring to that. And then these two figures sort of they loom large in this deserted landscape. I'm not sure if that's even realistic for a launch pad, right? I think of Florida. No, there's one in Houston. But this seems like we're almost in this western desert landscape. I think of like New Mexico or something like that. And so the landscape itself, very, very American, right? And then our other painting, what's precious inside of him does not care to be known by the mind in ways that diminish its presence. That's a more direct reference to Americana, with the American flag shirt, belt buckle, cowboy hat. So you could even relate this to what Beyonce is doing with Cowboy Carter, and how Beyonce described that she received a negative reception at the Country Music Awards when she performed with the Chicks. And so she was like, wait, like black people are part of the origin story of country music, and like I'm from Houston, Texas, so like America and Americana is for me and black people too. So maybe you're seeing some of that even in pop culture right now. And as the slide says there in text, their expressiveness and the variations in their gestures, clothing, and emotional auras reinforce the complex multiplicities of African American existence, but the persistent sense of privacy and mystery maintained in Sherald's work requires viewers to ponder the thoughts and dreams of the black men and women she has depicted. So related to this, right, you may have seen the portrait of Michelle Obama by Amy Sherald as it came along with the presidential portrait of Barack Obama by Kende Wiley. That is a tradition that the presidents and the first ladies are painted, and then those paintings go into the National Portrait Gallery. So the first black president, first black first lady, chose black artists to depict them. And these presidential and first lady portraits are typically very traditional, right? And white artists are going to be the ones painting them. But in this case, we have black artists chosen, and both of these artists, they're contemporary artists, so they both use some abstraction. And so with Amy Sherald's work, of course, she's going to use her signature grayscale, and that did upset and confuse some viewers who didn't understand why Michelle's skin tone was a little bit more gray instead of brown. But this particular portrait, you see Michelle Obama with an intellectual pose with her hand under her chin. She's a very, well-educated woman. She has a very powerful gaze. And then the dress she's wearing was designed by an artist. Okay, so imagine, right? The artist has either probably has a photo of Michelle Obama actually wearing this dress that was actually made, right? So that's what I mean by dress was designed by an artist. This was a real dress. And the dress has pop and op art references. You might know pop art as like Andy Warhol, celebrity, bright colors. Op art stands for optical illusion art. So you see the little kind of like the check marks in the plaid. That's where you're seeing that. And it also references black quilters in Alabama who are descendants from slaves that kind of go with their own symbolism as they're making their quilts. Amy Sherald also did a portrait of Breonna Taylor in 2020, and in a Vanity Fair article said, Breonna Taylor is an American girl. She is a sister, a daughter, and a hard worker. I would add Kentuckian to that, right? As you all probably know, Breonna Taylor was the victim of a police raid in Louisville in 2020. She goes on to say, those are the kinds of people that I am drawn toward, says Sherald. She calls this portrait a contribution to the moment and to activism, producing this image she hoped would keep Breonna alive forever. So she took extraordinary care in reimagining Breonna Taylor. And she said, she sees you seeing her. The hand on the hip is not passive. Her gaze is not passive. She looks strong. I wanted this image to stand as a piece of inspiration to keep fighting for justice for her. When I look at the dress, it kind of reminds me of Lady Justice. And when thinking about what she was going to wear, I wanted Brianna to like it. I wanted her family to look and say, I can see my daughter and sister in this. Brianna, what color do you want this dress to be? Please tell me what color you want this dress to be. She would kind of muse that out loud. And then she hit on a certain blue. It was a shade that reminded her of Breonna Taylor's March birthstone, the aquamarine. There are other, details and symbolism here. The gold cross on a chain necklace and the engagement ring that Breonna Taylor would never get to wear on her left hand. So Amy Sherald also did an art exhibit called The Great American Fact. And with that title, she's referring to an 1892 book by educator Anna Julia Cooper, who wrote that Black people are the great American fact. And in this body of work, she shows Black people at leisure. So let's kind of go back into a time machine and reflect on the artworks that we've seen by Amy Sherald. You remember The Girl Next Door? The woman staring at us in her polka-dotted dress with the plain blue background. And then we saw our young man in his American flag shirt and cowboy hat. And we saw our two figures standing in that deserted landscape with the rocket ship going off. And then we saw Michelle Obama's First Lady portrait. And we saw Breonna Taylor. And this series is Black people at leisure. And what is added to this, right, is more of a complex background, right? More of a, there's their activity, what they're doing matters, right? Whereas before it was mainly like this person that we were engaging with. And then not only like what they're doing, but they're specifically doing things associated with leisure. And that's to give that kind of perspective too, like Black people enjoying their life and experiencing joy. You go back to that book, The Quiet Resistance of, like leisure, rest, sleep, joy, fun. That's a form of resistance and, resisting oppression as well. So we just have our figures like surfing and at the beach, and we have a woman wearing a Barbie shirt tucked into a skirt, and they've got this beautiful home and car that they're posed in front of, and then this Black woman in front of her white picket fence with sunflowers and her yellow bicycle as well. And so it mentions here too, right, that Sherald is acclaiming for paintings of Black Americans at leisure that achieve the authority of landmarks in the great tradition of social portraiture, a tradition that for too long excluded the Black men, women, and families whose lives have been inextricable from the narrative of the American experience. So she's just attempting to restore a broader, fuller picture of humanity.